The snow wasn't just falling, it was a wall of white coming down, trying to erase the whole world. The sky was gone. The ground was gone. Even the mountains, those old giants of rock and pine, were just pale ghosts in the blizzard. Mary Beth Carter pushed forward, one step at a time, each one a small war against the cold. Her boots were soaked, her dress was a cage of ice, and the earth itself seemed to be pulling her down, trying to swallow her whole. The wind was a razor, slicing at her cheeks until they were numb and raw. Every breath she took felt like swallowing fire. She wasn't one to talk to herself, but the silence out here was a living thing, pressing in on her, and her body was shaking so hard from the cold and the fear. Words just tore themselves loose. "I ain't worth much, sir." She'd whispered those words before, into the dark corners of empty barns, into the palms of her own chapped hands, but saying them out here, in the heart of the storm, felt different. The words left her lips and the wind just snatched them away, like even the heavens didn't want to hear her confession. But the feeling stayed, a lead weight in her chest. Then, through the swirling chaos, she saw it. A dark shape against the white. A cabin. Her legs were hollow reeds, ready to snap. A thin ribbon of gray smoke curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth. A promise she felt she had no right to. She almost turned back right then. She could already see the faces from town, hear their whispers. Useless. Plain. Abandoned. A woman with nothing to offer. But the storm was a physical force, pushing her, shoving her forward until she stumbled and fell against the hard wood of the door. Her knuckles hit it once, weakly. A pathetic little knock. The door creaked open, and a man filled the frame. He was built like an old oak, broad and weathered. His beard was wild, dusted with frost, and his eyes were like chips of granite. He didn't say a word, just stared at her, the way a farmer stares at a hungry wolf sniffing around his hen house. Behind him, a fire danced and snapped, throwing shadows across a face carved by years of hardship. His silence was louder than any shout. He didn't want her here. Then another man appeared, younger, taller. His build was leaner, but you could see the strength coiled in him. His eyes were different. Softer. This was Levi McGraw. He took a half step forward, his hand starting to lift as if to help her, before he seemed to think better of it. But he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Pa," he said, "she'll freeze out there." The older man, Jonah, just grunted, didn't move an inch. The storm howled, a hungry beast clawing at the open door, whipping snow into Mary Beth's hair. She swayed, the world tilting, and that's when Levi decided he was done waiting for permission. He stepped right past his father, his hand closing around her elbow, and pulled her inside. The warmth hit her like a punch. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and curing hides. She staggered, dizzy from the sudden change. Jonah slammed the door shut with a crack that echoed in the small room, locking the storm out, but locking her in with his cold, hard disapproval. "Name?" Jonah's voice was gravel. She couldn't meet his gaze. "Mary Beth Carter," she whispered to the floorboards. Jonah gave a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes never left her. "From town," he stated. It wasn't a question. She knew better than to lie. In these mountains, gossip traveled faster than a wildfire. "From town," she confirmed. Levi led her toward the hearth, where a fire crackled and spit. The heat licked at her numb fingers, a painful, biting sensation. She felt a wave of despair so strong she thought she would break, but the tears wouldn't come. She'd cried them all out weeks ago, back when her husband walked out the door, his pockets full of promises he never intended to keep. The town had wasted no time with their whispers. She drove him off. Too poor, too plain, too quiet. She hadn't defended herself then, and she sure wasn't going to start now. Jonah's heavy boots stomped across the floor. He poured himself a mug of black coffee from a dented pot on the stove. He drank it standing, his back to her. He didn't offer her any, but Levi did. He ladled some thin broth from a pot into a wooden bowl and pressed it into her trembling hands. For a second, she looked at him, pride telling her to refuse. But the hunger was a wild animal in her belly, and it clawed that pride right aside. She drank. For what felt like an eternity, the only sounds were the fire and the scrape of her spoon against the bowl. When she finally felt enough strength return to sit up straight, Jonah spoke again. His words were as cold and sharp as icicles. "We don't take in strays. Storm's bad. You stay till it passes, then you move on." Mary Beth could only nod, bowing her head. "I thank you, sir. I won't be a trouble." Her voice was a thin, fragile thing, but the shame was a living creature, burrowing deep into her soul. She could feel it in Jonah's stare, in the heavy silence of the cabin, in the ghosts of the whispers that had followed her all the way up this mountain. She repeated the words, so softly they were almost lost in the crackle of the flames, the words that had become her truth. "I ain't worth much, sir." Jonah's face didn't change. He just stared, his expression unreadable stone. But Levi? Levi's jaw tightened. His eyes shot to her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in them. A flash of anger, of pain. As if her words had cut him too, in some way she could never possibly understand. And in that moment, she realized this cabin held more secrets than just hers. This wasn't just a storm she'd stumbled into. It was something else entirely. The storm didn't let up. It buried the world in a thick white shroud, sealing the three of them inside that small cabin like bugs in a jar. The days crawled by, each one a mirror of the last. Jonah chopped wood with a kind of grim fury, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Levi was quieter, checking his trap lines, his movements economical and sure. And Mary Beth, she tried to make herself invisible. She scrubbed the pans, she mended a tear in an old blanket, she swept the ashes from the hearth. Small tasks, meaningless tasks, but they kept her hands busy, kept them from shaking. She would catch Jonah watching her sometimes, his mouth set in a hard line, as if every chore she completed was just more proof of her uselessness. He didn't trust her. She could feel it. It was more than just disapproval of a stranger. It was something deeper, sharper. He watched her like he was waiting for her to make a mistake, to reveal some dark truth he was already certain she was hiding. One evening, as the wind screamed outside, she was adding a small log to the fire. Her hands were clumsy with cold, and the log slipped, rolling near the edge of the hearth. Before she could grab it, Jonah was there. He didn't just pick it up, he snatched it, his eyes blazing with a sudden cold fire. "Careful," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Wouldn't want you burning down what ain't yours." The accusation hung in the air, thick and choking. He thought she was a thief, or worse. She just stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She opened her mouth to apologize, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. What was the point? He'd already judged her. Levi stepped between them, his body a silent shield. "Pa, that's enough," he said, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable warning. Jonah shot his son a look that could curdle milk, but he backed away, tossing the log into the flames with a violent flick of his wrist. The tension in the cabin was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mary Beth retreated to her small pallet by the hearth, her whole body trembling. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Jonah's hatred wasn't just about her being a stray. It was personal. He was looking for a reason to throw her back out into the storm, and he was getting closer to finding one. A few days later, a figure appeared through the swirling snow. It was a neighbor, Hazel Dunn, bundled in expensive-looking furs. She stomped the snow from her boots on the porch, her eyes immediately finding Mary Beth huddled by the fire. A slow, malicious smile spread across her face. "Well, look what the storm blew in," Hazel drawled, her voice dripping with poison. "Folks in town said you'd run off for good, Mary Beth. Guess you found another roof to put over your head." The words were aimed at Mary Beth, but Hazel's sharp little eyes were darting around the cabin, taking everything in. She wasn't just here to gossip. She was looking for something. Jonah just grunted in response, offering her no encouragement. Levi stood stiffly by the window, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. Mary Beth kept her eyes on the flames, praying the woman would just leave. "Your husband left quite a mess behind," Hazel continued, her voice turning sharp. "Debts all over. Sheriff's been asking questions." This was a lie. Her husband had debts, but the sheriff wasn't involved. Hazel was fishing, testing her. "I don't know anything about that," Mary Beth said, her voice barely a whisper. Hazel let out a short, ugly laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you don't. A poor, helpless thing like you." Her eyes narrowed. "He didn't leave you with anything to get by on? Not even a little keepsake?" The question was too specific, too pointed. Mary Beth felt a jolt of pure terror. Hazel knew. She had to know. She risked a glance at Levi. He was looking at her now, his expression tight, a silent question in his eyes. She gave the slightest shake of her head. Hazel's smile vanished. She'd gotten her answer. "Well," she said, her voice turning cold. "Best be careful. This mountain has a way of swallowing up things that don't belong." And with that parting shot, she turned and left, disappearing back into the blizzard. The cabin felt colder after she was gone. The threat she'd left behind was a coiled snake in the middle of the room. Hazel wasn't just a town gossip. She was a hunter. And Mary Beth was her prey. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind clawed at the walls, and every scrape and whistle sounded like footsteps. Hazel's words echoed in her mind. Swallowing up things that don't belong. She had to leave. She couldn't put these men in danger. She rose from her pallet, moving like a ghost in the dim firelight. She gathered her thin shawl, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. She took one last look at the sleeping figures. Jonah, a hard silhouette on his cot. Levi, his face peaceful in sleep, a stark contrast to the tension he carried when he was awake. Her hand was on the door latch when a floorboard creaked behind her. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Levi. He wasn't asleep. He was sitting up on his cot, watching her. He didn't say a word. He just held her gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood up, walked to the hearth, and placed another large log on the dying embers. The fire flared up, casting a warm, protective light over her side of the room. He looked at her again, his expression steady, deliberate. It was a clear message. "Stay. You're safe here." Then he lay back down and turned his back, as if the moment had never happened. Mary Beth's hand fell away from the latch. She returned to her pallet, a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was something quieter, something more dangerous. Hope. But she also knew, with a sinking feeling, that the danger Hazel represented hadn't gone away. It was just waiting, biding its time, somewhere out there in the endless, swirling white. And soon, it would come for them all. The false peace didn't last. The storm raged on, a relentless assault, and the cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a cage. Food was running low. The salted meat was nearly gone. The flour sack was worryingly light. And with the hunger came a sharper edge to Jonah's temper. His words became clipped, his patience worn down to a nub. He watched Mary Beth's every move, his eyes filled with a simmering resentment. "Another mouth to feed," he muttered one morning, just loud enough for her to hear as she portioned out the thin oatmeal. The words were a slap in the face. She tried to work harder, to prove she wasn't a burden. She mended a tear in Levi's coat with thread she'd painstakingly unraveled from the hem of her own dress. She hauled buckets of water from the well, the wind tearing at her, the cold biting her fingers to the bone. She never complained. She never spoke unless spoken to. But her silence, her quiet endurance, seemed to infuriate Jonah even more. He saw it as weakness, a confirmation of what he already believed. One evening, the blizzard reached a terrifying crescendo. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the small cabin shuddered with each powerful gust. The three of them sat around the fire, the silence stretching taut between them. Jonah stared into the flames, his face a grim mask. Finally, his bitterness boiled over. He turned his cold eyes on Mary Beth. "Dead weight," he said, his voice flat and brutal. "Out here, dead weight gets cut loose. You learn that quick, or you don't learn it at all." The cruelty of it stole her breath. It was one thing to be thought of as a burden, another to be told so directly, so coldly. All the shame, all the fear, all the weeks of being ground down by the town's scorn and her husband's betrayal, it all came rushing back. And the words, the awful, familiar words, spilled from her lips before she could stop them. Her voice broke on a sob. "I know. I ain't worth much, sir." The cabin fell silent. Even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. The fire popped, a sharp, violent sound in the stillness. Levi, who had been methodically sharpening his hunting knife, set it down with a deliberate click. His head came up, and his eyes were flashing with a fire that rivaled the one in the hearth. For the first time since she'd arrived, his voice rose, sharp and commanding, cutting through the heavy air. "Don't say that." The words were a raw command, but beneath the anger, she heard something else, a tremor of grief, a deep, aching sorrow. He looked from her to his father, and the look on his face was one of open defiance, of a dam finally breaking. And then he said the words that changed everything. "She's the one," he said, his voice ringing with a strange, fierce conviction. "She's the one Ma was looking for." Jonah went rigid. His head snapped toward his son, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. 1,000 questions exploded in Mary Beth's mind. Ma? Levi's mother? What did she have to do with any of this? But Levi wasn't finished. He held his father's gaze, his jaw locked. "You know it's true," he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with an old, buried pain. Before she went into the storm, she was looking for her family." Mary Beth stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating a truth she couldn't yet understand, but could feel in her very bones. This was no accident. Her stumbling upon this cabin, in this storm. It was something else. A reckoning. Jonah's face had gone pale beneath his weathered skin. The stony mask had cracked, and for a terrifying second, she saw the raw grief and guilt he kept buried so deep. He looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time, and it wasn't with suspicion or contempt. It was with a dawning, horrified recognition. The words he spoke were barely a whisper, a ghost of a sound torn from his soul. "Carter," he breathed. "Your name is Carter." It wasn't a question, it was a curse. Suddenly the story everyone in town told, the story of Jonah McGraw's wife wandering out into a blizzard, lost to grief, it felt like a lie. A carefully constructed story to hide a much darker secret. And Mary Beth was standing right in the middle of it. The wind howled, and the cabin no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a tomb, and the ghosts of the past were clawing at the door, demanding to be let in. The air in the cabin had changed. It was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts Levi had summoned. Jonah was a statue of grim silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't just anger. It was fear. He avoided looking at Mary Beth, but she could feel his eyes on her when she wasn't looking, a heavy, measuring gaze. He was weighing her, weighing the past, and she knew he was trying to decide what to do. Levi's words hung between them, a permanent echo. She's the one Ma was looking for. What did it mean? Mary Beth's mind raced, trying to connect the pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed. Her family was from these parts, generations back. But they'd lost their land, lost everything. They were sharecroppers, then they were nothing, scattered by poverty and bad luck. She'd never known the details. It was just another story of hardship, the kind that was common as stone in these mountains. But now, that old story felt different. It felt important. She tried to ask Levi, tried to catch him alone, but Jonah was always there, a looming shadow. The work continued, a grim pantomime of normalcy. She fetched water. Levi split wood. Jonah sharpened his axe with slow, deliberate strokes, the sound of steel on stone grating on her nerves. The unspoken tension was a poison, seeping into the very logs of the cabin. She started noticing things. A small, locked chest under Jonah's cot that he never opened. The way his hand would sometimes go to it, as if to make sure it was still there. She saw the way Levi watched his father, a look of profound sadness and disappointment in his eyes. This was an old wound between them, and her arrival had torn it wide open. One night, she was woken by a sound. It was Jonah. He was standing by the hearth, his back to her, a small, leather-bound book in his hands. It looked like a journal. He was staring at it, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sight was so unexpected, so jarring, that she didn't dare move. After a long moment, he closed the book, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and placed it carefully back into the locked chest. He thought she was asleep. He didn't know she'd seen him. He didn't know she'd seen the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. The next day, the storm showed its first sign of weakness. The wind still blew, but the relentless driving snow had eased to flurries. Jonah made a decision. "We need supplies," he announced, his voice rough. "Levi, you'll go to town." Levi nodded, but then Mary Beth spoke up, her own voice surprising her with its strength. "I'll go with you." Jonah turned on her, his eyes cold. "You'll stay here." "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "There are things I need to find out, things in town." It was a gamble. She was pushing back, and she didn't know how he would react. Levi looked from his father to her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment Jonah just stared at her, the silence stretching. She expected him to explode, to forbid it. But instead, he gave a short, bitter nod. "Fine," he snapped. "Go! See what the gossips have to say. See what good it does you." It wasn't permission. It was a challenge. He was daring her to uncover the truth he was so desperate to keep buried. The journey to town was brutal. The snow was deep, hiding treacherous patches of ice. Levi led the way, his movements sure and steady, but he was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. The general store was a shock of warmth and noise. And standing right in the middle of it, like a spider in her web, was Hazel Dunn. Her eyes lit up when she saw them, a cruel, triumphant gleam. She didn't waste any time. "Well, well," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Look who crawled down from the mountain. Still living off the charity of the McGraths, Mary Beth?" The other patrons fell silent, their eyes turning to her. Mary Beth felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck. But then she remembered Levi's words, Jonah's tears. This wasn't just about her anymore. "I earn my keep," she said, her voice steady. Hazel laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But I wonder if old Jonah knows who he's really sheltering." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I wonder if he knows about the Carter land, the land his own father took." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. It was true. The whispers weren't just about her being plain or poor. They were about a history she never knew. Her family had owned land, McGraw land. Before Mary Beth could process the bombshell, Levi stepped in front of her. "That's enough, Hazel," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is family business." "Family?" Hazel sneered. "She's nothing to you. She's a thief, just like her husband. He came sniffing around, asking questions about that land too, before he ran off." Another twist of the knife. Her husband. He hadn't just abandoned her. He'd been looking for something. For the truth. And maybe that's why he'd left. Maybe someone had scared him away. Someone like Hazel. Or someone working for her. Suddenly the pieces clicked into place. Hazel didn't just want some little trinket. She wanted the land. And she thought Mary Beth had the key. "You stay away from her," Levi warned, his hand resting on the axe handle at his belt. Hazel just smiled, a cold, confident little smile. "The storm's not over," she said softly. "The mountain always takes what it's owed. One way or another." She turned and swept out of the store, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Mary Beth looked at Levi, her mind reeling. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just grabbed the sack of flour, threw the coins on the counter and said, "We need to go. Now." As they stepped back out into the biting wind, she knew one thing for sure. They weren't just running from the storm anymore. They were running from a past that was very much alive and very, very dangerous. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of churning thoughts. Hazel's words echoed in her head. The Carter land. The land his own father took. It was a truth so large it seemed to blot out the sky. Her family, once landowners. The McGraths, their usurpers, and Jonah's wife. His wife had been looking for her. To what? Atone for the sins of the past? The implications were staggering. When they finally reached the cabin, Jonah was waiting on the porch, his silhouette dark against the failing light. He knew. He could see it on their faces. As soon as they were inside, the fragile truce shattered. "What did she say?" Jonah demanded, his eyes boring into Mary Beth. She stood her ground, her voice shaking but clear. "She said your father stole my family's land." The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Jonah flinched as if struck. He didn't deny it. He just sank onto a stool, the fight seeming to drain out of him, replaced by a weariness that went bone deep. "It was a card game," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "My father was a hard man. He won the deed. Fair and square, he always said. But it wasn't, was it?" Levi's voice cut in, laced with an old anger. "Ma found the proof. She found your father's letter, admitting he cheated, admitting he ruined them." Jonah's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a desperate pain. "Your mother knew nothing." "She knew everything," Levi shot back. "She found the original deed, the real one. She was going to find the Carters, to make it right. That's why she went out in that storm, wasn't it? She wasn't running from grief. She was running to do the right thing. She was running from you." The accusation, so raw and terrible, hung in the air. Jonah visibly crumpled. The truth, finally spoken aloud, broke him. "I tried to stop her," he choked out, the words torn from him. "I told her it was foolishness, that the past was the past. We argued. She ran out. I went after her, but the storm, it was too fast. I lost her." He buried his face in his hands, his body racked with sobs that had been held back for years. He hadn't just lost his wife to the snow. He'd driven her into it. His guilt wasn't just grief. It was complicity. Mary Beth felt a wave of pity so strong it almost knocked her over. This man, this hard, cruel man, was just a prisoner of his own history, haunted by a single, terrible mistake. She looked at the small, locked chest under his cot. The proof? The letter? The deed. It was all in there. Suddenly, a new storm began to rage, this one far more violent than the one outside. The door burst open with a crash, and Hazel Dunn stood there, no longer smiling. Behind her were two rough-looking men, their faces grim, their hands holding rifles. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Hazel said, her voice like ice. Her eyes weren't on Jonah or Levi. They were locked on Mary Beth. "My grandfather was cheated by Jonah's father, too. He was owed a debt. That land is my payment." Her story was a lie, twisted to serve her own greed, but her intent was deadly real. The men raised their rifles. The cabin, once a shelter, had just become a trap. There was nowhere to run. The battle for the mountain, for the past, for their very lives, was about to begin right here, in this tiny room, while the storm screamed for blood outside. The two men moved into the room, their rifles steady. They were big, hard men, their eyes cold and empty. Hazel followed them in, a look of triumph on her face. She'd waited for this moment, planned for it. She'd used the story of the stolen land to fuel her own greed, twisting a historical wrong into a justification for murder. "The chest!" she snapped, pointing a gloved finger at the small box under Jonah's cot. "Open it." Jonah, still reeling from his confession, looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Get out of my house," he growled. One of the men laughed, a low, ugly sound. He took a step forward and slammed the butt of his rifle into Jonah's side. The old man cried out and collapsed to the floor, clutching his ribs. "Pa!" Levi yelled, lunging forward, but the second man was faster. He swung his rifle like a club, catching Levi across the side of the head. Levi staggered back, a dark line of blood appearing at his temple, and fell against the wall, stunned. It happened so fast. Mary Beth stood frozen for a half second, pure terror icing her veins. This was it. This was how it ended. Hazel's men would kill them all, take the deeds, and bury the secret forever under the snow. But then she saw the fire poker, resting in its stand by the hearth. And something inside her, something that had been dormant for years, a core of strength she never knew she possessed, ignited. She wasn't the weak, useless woman from town anymore. She was a survivor. While Hazel and her men were focused on the chest, Mary Beth moved. She snatched the heavy iron poker, its weight solid and real in her hand. Hazel's back was to her. "Hurry up!" Hazel was saying to one of the men, who was trying to pry the lock on the chest. "Get it open!" Mary Beth didn't hesitate. She swung the poker with all her might. It connected with the back of Hazel's head with a sickening thud. Hazel let out a choked gasp and crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The two men spun around, their faces shocked. For a crucial second, they were caught off guard. That second was all Levi needed. Shaking his head to clear it, he launched himself at the man closest to him, tackling him around the waist. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, wrestling for control of the rifle. The other man raised his weapon, aiming it at Levi, but Jonah, with a roar of pure rage, surged up from the floor. He ignored the fire in his ribs and slammed his body into the gunman's legs. The rifle went off with a deafening blast, the bullet tearing through the ceiling, raining splinters down on them. Mary Beth didn't freeze this time. The man who had hit Levi was trying to get his rifle free. She swung the poker again, bringing it down hard on his hands. He screamed as bones crunched, and the rifle clattered to the floor. Levi kicked it away. The first man, the one Jonah had tackled, threw the old man off and scrambled to his feet, pulling a long hunting knife from his belt. He advanced on Mary Beth, his eyes filled with murderous intent. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. But Jonah was behind him. He grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove, the one Mary Beth had scrubbed clean just that morning, and brought it down on the back of the man's head. He dropped like a sack of rocks. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The cabin was a wreck. Two men lay unconscious on the floor, Hazel beside them. Levi was breathing heavily, blood trickling down his face. Jonah stood over the man he'd struck, the skillet still in his hand, his chest heaving. And Mary Beth stood in the middle of it all, the iron poker clutched in her white-knuckled grip, her heart pounding like a war drum. The storm still howled outside, but inside the cabin, there was a stunned, ringing silence. They had survived. They had fought back. They had won. And in the flickering firelight, the three of them looked at each other. The broken old man, the wounded son, and the woman who was worth more than she had ever known. They weren't just three strangers anymore. They were a family, forged in secrets and blood and fire. They worked quickly, their movements synchronized by adrenaline. Levi found rope in a storage bin, and they tied up Hazel and her two thugs, binding their hands and feet securely. They were a problem for the law now, not for them. As the immediate danger passed, the emotional fallout hit them. Levi gently took the poker from Mary Beth's hands. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching her face. She could only nod, the words stuck in her throat. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of wood from her hair, his fingers lingering for a moment against her cheek. Jonah, meanwhile, walked over to the chest. The lock was broken. He knelt down and lifted the lid. He reached inside and pulled out a bundle of old papers, tied with a faded ribbon. He didn't look at them. He just held them out to Mary Beth. "They're yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They were always yours." She took the papers, her fingers trembling as she untied the ribbon. There it was, the original deed to the land, her family's name, Carter, written in elegant looping script. And beneath it, a letter. She read the cramped, spidery handwriting of Jonah's father. It was all there. A confession of a drunken, rigged card game, of a moment of greed that had destroyed a family. And tucked inside that letter was another, written in a different hand. A woman's hand. It was from Levi's mother, written the day she died. "My dearest Jonah," it began. "I cannot live with this shadow over our family. It is a poison that has seeped into the soil of this mountain. I have to make it right. I am going to find the Carters. If you will not help me, I will go alone. Please, understand. This is not about the past. It is about our son's future. It is about his soul." Tears streamed down Mary Beth's face as she read the words of the woman who had died trying to find her. She looked up at Jonah. He was weeping openly now, the hard stone of his face washed clean by years of unshed tears. "I was a fool," he whispered, proud and scared. "I lost her because I was a coward." "You lost her because of his sin," Levi said, placing a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. "Not yours, but we can make it right. We can honor her now." The storm finally broke with the dawn. Sunlight, brilliant and clear, streamed through the cabin window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a new day, a new world. They looked out the door at the landscape, buried under a pristine blanket of white, the air so clean it hurt to breathe. The mountain was silent, at peace. The past had been unearthed, the violence had passed, and what was left was the quiet, simple truth. Later that day, Levi hitched the horse to the sled to take Hazel and her men to the sheriff in town. Before he left, he turned to Mary Beth. "This land is yours now," he said. "You can do with it what you will. Sell it. Stay. It's your choice." Jonah stood beside him, nodding in agreement. "This is your home," the old man said, his voice filled with a humility she never thought possible. "If you'll have it." Mary Beth looked from the deed in her hand to the rugged, beautiful mountain glittering in the sun. She looked at the small, sturdy cabin that had been her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at the two men who had become her unlikely family. She thought of the whispers in town, of her husband who had run, of the shame she had carried for so long. It all felt like a story about someone else. The world had tried to tell her she was worthless. But the world was wrong. Worth wasn't something given to you. It was something you claimed. It was forged in fire, earned in struggle, and found in the courage to stand up and fight, not just for your land, but for your soul. She smiled, a real, true smile that reached her eyes. "I think," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I'm already home. If you were moved by Mary Beth's journey from shame to strength, and you believe that the deepest wounds can be healed, then do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And we have to ask, let us know in the comments below. When everything was on the line, would you have picked up that fire poker?